Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your time in attending this presentation, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to talk to you today about beta thalassemia and the hemoglobinopathies. So my name is Frances Smith. I work at the Synovis Genetics Laboratory at King's College Hospital in London. I'm a clinical scientist, and in my laboratory we specialise in the genetic diagnosis of inherited haematological conditions, and one of those groups of diseases is the hemoglobinopathies, which I'm going to talk to you about today. So just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk to you about today. So first of all, we're going to go through the different hemoglobin proteins that are involved in the hemoglobinopathies as a group of disorders. We're going to talk about the symptoms of hemoglobinopathies, and then I'll talk to you about the different types of hemoglobinopathy. So we'll talk about the thalassemias, so beta thalassemia and alpha thalassemia. We'll also talk about sickle cell disease and some of the other hemoglobin variants which can contribute to sickle cell disease and thalassemias. We'll then go on to talk about some of the methods that we use for the diagnosis of hemoglobinopathies within the laboratory, and I'll focus on some of the key laboratory tests that are used both to diagnose patients affected with the disorders and also to identify people who are heterozygous carriers of the disorder. So we'll go through some of the protein assays and also some of the genetic tests that are used. So, just to begin with, hemoglobinopathies are disorders of either hemoglobin production, which are the thalassemias, or of hemoglobin function. So those are the sickle cell diseases and related variants. So within the thalassemias, we have beta thalassemia, which is caused by mutations in the beta globin gene. We also have alpha thalassemia, which is caused by mutations in the alpha globin genes. So you have on each chromosome one copy of the alpha 1 and one copy of the alpha 2. So there are two alpha globin genes on each chromosome, and you need expression from both to contribute to the hemoglobin. We're then going to talk about the hemoglobin variants. So sickle cell disease is the most common cause of the sickle mutation is the most common cause of sickle cell disease, but there are also other variants which can contribute to sickle cell disorders. So those are hemoglobin C and some other rarer ones which we'll discuss. There are also some unstable hemoglobins which can contribute to the various types of hemoglobinopathies, both thalassemias and sickle cell disease. So in order to understand this group of conditions, we need to understand hemoglobin. So what does it do? What's its function? So there are various different types of hemoglobin, which all have different functions, and they are expressed at different times during our lives. So hemoglobin A, which is the predominant hemoglobin protein that is produced during adulthood, which its primary function is to transport oxygen and hemoglobin, oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body. So this is a picture here, a diagram showing the different subunits of adult hemoglobin or hemoglobin A. So you can see that each hemoglobin protein is a tetramer, and it comprises 4 different subunits, 2 alpha globin proteins and 2 beta globin protein chains, and the beta globins are encoded by the HBB gene and the alphas by the HBA1 and HBA2. And each of these globin chains contains a heme group, and within each heme group there is one molecule of iron. Now, the primary function of the hemoglobin being to transport oxygen, each one of these heme groups can bind to one oxygen molecule. So each hemoglobin tetramer can transport 4 oxygen molecules in one go. So they pick up the oxygen in the lungs, and then they transport the oxygen to the tissues where it's delivered. Because in the tissues you have a lower oxygen saturation, so the heme group will bind to the oxygen when the oxygen saturation is high, and then it will deliver it to the tissues where the oxygen saturation is low. And it's this reversible binding that is a really, really key component of the function of the hemoglobin. Now, we also have fetal hemoglobin. So this is in the laboratory and clinically called hemoglobin F. So the F standing for fetal. Now, the hemoglobin F is expressed in the developing fetus, and it is encoded by different genes. So instead of HBB or beta globin, it's two gamma globin chains which are encoded by HBG1 and HBG2, and also two alpha globin chains which are encoded by the same two genes. So what happens is, during fetal development, the hemoglobin F is expressed, and hemoglobin F has a higher affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin, and this is to allow the fetal hemoglobin to absorb oxygen in the placenta, where the oxygen saturation is lower. And then when the baby is born, this process called hemoglobin switching occurs, where the expression of your gamma globin chains is gradually reduced, and the expression of your beta globin chains is increased. So you get this, after birth, you get this gradual increase in the production of hemoglobin A, adult hemoglobin, and a decrease in the production of hemoglobin F. And then by the time you're about 9 months old, you are predominantly expressing hemoglobin A, adult hemoglobin. The last hemoglobin for you to be aware of, which is important in clinically and in the diagnosis of hemoglobinopathies, is the hemoglobin A2. So this is a minor adult hemoglobin fraction. If we just go back to the last slide, you can see at the bottom here, the green section represents your hemoglobin A2 expression. So you can see that it's only expressed about sort of 2 to 3% of the adult hemoglobin. So it's a very minor hemoglobin fraction, but it's a very, very useful indicator of beta thalassemia. So it's very useful in the diagnosis of beta thalassemia. Now, it's also a tetramer, but instead of beta globin, there are delta globin chains, so HBD, and that's also with your two hemoglobin A genes. Now, you can see here in this diagram the two gene clusters which encode. At the top here, you can see the alpha globin gene cluster with your two alpha 1, alpha 2 genes, and then the little green circle is the HS40, which is the locus control region. So this is the region of the gene cluster which controls the expression of the alpha 1 and alpha 2 genes. And then at the bottom, you can see this is your beta globin gene cluster. So you've got your beta globin there on the right, and then you've got your delta globin, which makes up your hemoglobin A2, and then your two gamma globin chains which go to make up your fetal hemoglobin. And then there's also this minor epsilon globin, which is an embryonic form of hemoglobin. Now, the beta globin gene cluster is also controlled by a locus control region, which again is a series of enhancers which controls expression across the cluster, and it's very, very tightly controlled expression because of this complex kind of interplay between the fetal and adult forms of hemoglobin. So those are the hemoglobins that we're going to talk about today and that are affected by the hemoglobinopathies. So the symptoms of hemoglobinopathies, so here you see the thalassemias on the left and sickle cell disease on the right. Now they have some fairly unifying symptoms, so of symptoms of anemia, of fatigue, jaundice, frequent infections, and then with the thalassemias you also get some bone abnormalities, delayed growth, and enlarged spleen or liver. And with sickle cell disease you have these painful sickle cell crises and a syndrome called acute chest syndrome, which we'll go into a bit later. Patients with sickle cell disease are also at higher risk of strokes. and some clinical terms for you to be aware of that are used in diagnostics and treatment of sickle cell disease, management of patients with sickle cell disease and thalassemia. So the first is transfusion-dependent thalassemia. Now, this term has largely replaced the previously used term thalassemia major. So this is where the patients largely have little or no expression of beta globin, and they are transfusion dependent. And then there are non-transfusion dependent thalassemias, which were previously known as thalassemia minor. Some other terms that are used quite a lot, and I'll use throughout the talk: anemia. This is where your hemoglobin level on your full blood count is less than 100 grams per litre. There is a slightly lower threshold for antenatal screening, just because of how common anemia is during pregnancy. Microcytosis, so this describes when the red blood cells are small, so your MCV less than 77, and hyperchromia, which are pale red blood cells, so where the MCH is less than 25 picograms. So these are the key kind of laboratory features that we're looking at in the thalassemias and sickle cell disease. So just to begin with, a bit more detail about beta thalassemia. So as I've said, caused by mutations in the HBB gene, beta globin gene. It's largely an autosomal recessive condition, which means you have to inherit a mutated copy of the beta globin gene from both parents. So you have a mutation on both alleles. There are some very, very rare dominant forms of beta thalassemia where the clinical condition is expressed in a heterozygote. And those types of mutations are usually acting in a dominant negative fashion. So this is where most commonly there is an elongation of the protein, which can cause these toxic inclusions. Now, beta thalassemia is described as a reduced quantity of beta globin disorder, where you don't produce enough. So the level of reduction is directly in proportion to the severity of the disorder. So there are several terms that we have that describe the severity of this reduction. And the resulting clinical phenotype. So there's beta plus thalassemia, where you have a slightly reduced amount of beta globin. You have severe beta plus, where you have a little bit of beta globin made. You have beta zero, where you have no beta globin made from that gene. And then we have these dominant beta thalassemias, which we just touched on. So moving on to the alpha thalassemias. So this is a group of disorders which are caused by mutations in the HbA1 and HbA2 genes, the alpha globin genes. These are also autosomal recessive. The key difference with alpha globin is that on each chromosome you have 2 copies of the alpha globin gene, alpha 1 and alpha 2. And the level of reduction in expression, again, is directly proportional to the clinical severity. So there are different phenotypes associated with having, so each adult, each person will have 4 copies of alpha globin, and there's a different phenotype associated with having 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of those alpha globin genes mutated. Because of the high level of sequence similarity between the 2 genes, we have a very high frequency of deletion mutations, and this is caused by non-homologous recombination. And the terms that we have to describe the severity of the reduction in production and then the resulting clinical phenotype is similar to the beta thal, but these are alpha plus and alpha zero. So with alpha plus, you have 1 gene affected on 1 chromosome, and with alpha zero, you have 2 genes affected on 1 chromosome. And then this diagram is just to show you that clinical spectrum that we have associated with alpha thalassemia. So you can see with each of these pictures, the black lines represent each chromosome. So normal chromosome complement would be 4 alpha globin genes, 2 alpha 1, 2 alpha 2s. And this is a blood film representation. If you have one gene deleted, that's called a silent carrier, where you don't have an overt clinical phenotype at all, but the patients do have, if you're a carrier, you would have a slightly reduced MCV and MCH, so slightly small red blood cells and slightly pale red blood cells. There are also then 2 types of alpha thalassemia minor carriers. So as you can see, you can either have 2 genes deleted, 1 from each chromosome, as with this picture on the left, or 2 genes deleted from 1 chromosome. The overall complement of alpha globin genes is still 2. So there's not a hugely overt clinical phenotype, but again, there's a slightly more severe microcytosis and slightly more severe hyperchromia associated with that. Now, these 2 scenarios on the right here are both describing a kind of overt clinical phenotype. So this is where we get into the kind of disease state, where the first one is HBH disease, where you have just 1 copy of alpha globin remaining, and then HB Bart's hydrops fatalis, which is a very, very, very severe form of alpha thalassemia, which actually presents in utero and can have quite severe consequences for the mother of the baby as well. So very, very important to identify these carriers in the neonatal period so that the appropriate maternal care can be made. Now, thalassemias are all about globin chain imbalance. So when you have a normal chromosomal complement of your alpha and beta globin genes, you have this balanced expression of alpha and beta globin, which mean that all the alpha and beta chains are formed into those tetramers, which form the functional hemoglobin. But with beta thalassemia, you have reduced beta thalassemia, so you get an excess of alpha globin chains, and with alpha thalassemia, you get a reduction in alpha and it's excess of beta. So it's all about these excess alpha and beta chains, which are causative of the disease. And these 2, I've got 2 pictures here, but they're very similar in terms of describing the pathophysiology of the 2 disorders. So with beta thalassemia, you get the deficient beta chains, you get this unbalanced alpha beta ratio. The excess alpha chains then form aggregates and intracellular inclusions, which cause damage to the red cell membrane, which then means you end up with hemolysis, apoptosis, impaired erythropoiesis, and these hyperchromic microcytic cells, which we talked about. So that's how the disorder is actually formed. It's the hemolysis, which then results in the anemia and the sequestration of the hemolyzed blood cells in the spleen. And it's exactly the same with alpha. In that it's the excess alpha, the excess beta chain, sorry. So just moving on to sickle cell disease. So the pathophysiology of sickle cell disease is very different to thalassemia. So sickle cell anemia is caused by one specific mutation in the beta globin gene. This is the nomenclature here on the first line, C.28T. And this is the worldwide genomic nomenclature that we use for genetic mutations. It's also known as HBS, so sickle. It's inherited in autosomal recessive fashion. So again, you have to inherit a mutation from the mother and the father. And the key difference with sickle is that it can also be caused by combinations of other variants in the beta globin gene. And I've just put a list here of the clinically relevant variants for your awareness. And some of these are, so HBC is actually a mutation at the same amino acid codon as sickle, and is a slightly milder form of sickle cell disease. And you can see on the right here a picture of a blood film of a patient with a sickle cell there in the middle. So that's the characteristic sickle cell shape. And the way that the sickle mutation causes the disease symptoms is that the abnormal hemoglobin molecules within the red blood cell, and when they're dehydrated, they will cause polymerization of the protein, which forms strands within the cell, and it causes it to change its conformation, change its shape, and form these sickle cells, which are very rigid structures. Now, usually in a normal red blood cell, the cell membrane is a really complex network of proteins which allow the cell to remain flexible so that it can move within the circulatory system through all the very small capillaries and maintain the gas exchange across that membrane. But with sickle cell disease, what happens is the sickle cells get very sticky, so they can easily form clumps and block up the very small blood vessels within the body, and this is what causes the symptom of this acute pain episodes within the body. So, moving on now to some of the laboratory testing that is used for hemoglobinopathies. So the first one, and we've been through some of the terms from the full blood count earlier on in the talk. So the full blood count is usually performed on one of these analyzers at the top. They're usually fully automated, very common laboratory test. We also do protein analysis, so HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography, capillary electrophoresis, and mass spectrometry, and these three are all methods for analysing the actual hemoglobin proteins themselves. And lastly, genetic testing, which doesn't involve looking at the hemoglobin molecules, but looking at the genes themselves, so to pick up the actual causative mutations. Now, there's various different reasons why you might do these tests. So firstly, for diagnosis. So if there's a patient who you suspect as being affected with a hemoglobinopathy. There's also for carrier screening, so to identify people who might be at risk of having a child affected with one of the hemoglobinopathies. Also antenatal testing. So in the UK, we have an antenatal screening program which aims to pick up carriers of sickle cell disease and thalassemia in the antenatal period, and this is to allow the parents, if they so wish, to opt for prenatal testing, so to be able to determine what the genotype of the baby is going to be. We also, here in the UK, have a newborn screening program. So this is again to pick up patients affected at a very early stage, and this is to allow early implementation of treatment. So one of the main treatments is prophylactic antibiotics. So this is to reduce the level of infections that the patients have. So this is just an example of a full blood count that you would expect for a beta thalassemia carrier, and across, so down the side you have your different full blood count indices, so red blood cell count, hemoglobin, MCV and MCH. So the normal ranges here in the first column. The second column is a very mild silent beta thalassemia mutation, so you can see that the red blood cell indices are not affected. The second column, minus 29, this is a beta plus thalassemia mutation, so you can see that you have a slightly reduced hemoglobin, you also have a slightly reduced MCV and MCH, and I'll go on to the last two boxes in a minute. So HbA2 and the HbF, those are the protein assays, which we'll talk about shortly. The minus 110, that's a severe beta plus thalassemia mutation. So you can see that we've now got a slightly raised red blood cell count, a reduced hemoglobin level, and a reduced MCV and MCH. Now, the reason why you get a slightly raised red blood cell count is because you have a slightly increased erythropoietic drive. You're producing more red blood cells because of this reduced hemoglobin. And the last mutation type is this beta 0 in this last column, IVS2 minus 1. So that's a specific mutation. Again, you've got slightly raised red cell count, slightly low hemoglobin, and then a more severe reduction in your MCV and MCH. And just to show you how that distinguishes with the alpha thalassemia carriers, so the key difference is the normal hemoglobin A2. So in all the beta thalassemia carriers, I'll just go back, they have a slight a raised hemoglobin A2 level, but the alpha thalassemia carriers all have normal hemoglobin A2, but they still have this reduced hemoglobin level, and it gets more and more reduced as per how many alpha globin genes are affected. So you've got normal, alpha plus thalassemia carrier where you've got 1 gene deleted, alpha 0 carrier where you've got 2 genes deleted, and then HbH disease where you've got 3 genes deleted. So you can see in this HbH disease full blood count, there's quite severe anemia here. And they all have this reduced MCH, and the degree of microcytosis and hyperchromia gets worse as you reduce your number of alpha globin genes that are functional. Now, HPLC, so this is the main method for determining the different proteins which are within the patient's blood sample. So we take a liquid blood sample. It enables us to quantify the hemoglobin F, A2, and hemoglobin A, and and several variants such as S, C, and D. So with HPLC, so high performance liquid chromatography, what happens is within the machine here that you see on the right, so you load your blood samples in and they get run through the machine, and within the machine there's a column, and different buffers are applied to that column to produce an ionic gradient across the column. Now, when the hemoglobins are applied to that column, the different variant hemoglobins have different retention times within that column as determined by their ionic properties. So it allows you to visualize which hemoglobins are present and at what percentage within your sample. So this machine is what we use in our lab. This is a BioRed variant 2, but there are lots and lots and lots of different types of HPLC, so this is not the only one that's available. So this is an example of a normal HPLC plot. So what you are returned from the HPLC is at the bottom here, you can see this graph. Now along the bottom, you've got the retention time in minutes of the different hemoglobins. So that's the retention time within the column. And then on the y-axis here, you've got the percentage. So this is the percentage of each of the hemoglobins within the sample. So there's a big peak here in the middle at 2.33. This is your hemoglobin A. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of the talk, that's your adult hemoglobin, which forms the majority of your hemoglobins in an adult. And you can see in the table at the top, you've got your then the different peaks are named. So this is your A0, 86%, and this is the characteristic retention time here. You have your hemoglobin A2, so this is your delta globin chains with your alphas, and that's at 3.1%, and that's about normal. So you'd expect around 2 to 3% in a normal individual. You've then got your hemoglobin F at 0.3, and the hemoglobin F is tiny little peak down here you can see in grey. And then these bits in the middle, so the P2, the P3, these are all sort of products of degradation of the hemoglobin. So obviously there is a time between the blood sample being taken and it being run on the analyzer. So within that time you get a certain level of degradation, and this is where those degraded products usually come out on the HPLC. So these are not kind of diagnostically important. The only thing to note here is that the HbA1c, so the glycated hemoglobin, which is used as a diagnostic marker in diabetes, runs with the P3. So you have to just be careful that you don't mistake hemoglobin A1c for a raised P3 or vice versa. So that's just for awareness, really. So this is a typical HPLC plot for a beta thalassemia carrier. So you can see again, you've got that big peak in the middle, which is your HbA, so your adult hemoglobin. Then you've got a raised A2, so on the right here, slightly higher, so that's at 5.2%. So that's about within the range you'd expect for a beta thalassemia carrier. So anything above about 3.5, 3.6, 3.7% in the A2, that's when we start to think about possible beta thalassemia carrier. And then you've got the other hemoglobin variants as described before. And then this is an example of a plot, a HPLC plot from a sickle cell carrier. So again, you've got your hemoglobin A in the middle here, but then you've got another large peak at a retention time of about 4.4 minutes, which is your hemoglobin S window. So this slightly sharper peak here represents your hemoglobin S, and then you've still got your A2 and your hemoglobin F. So this is really just a kind of classic example of a sickle cell carrier. And then I haven't got examples of the other hemoglobin variants, but each of the hemoglobin variants will have a characteristic retention time. So what you would see is the non-hemoglobin A peak, you would see that moving around with different variants. And now moving on to the genetic testing. So that's what we do here in my lab. Now, genetic testing is used for definitive diagnosis of all hemoglobinopathies. Now, the full blood count and the protein screening can be used diagnostically for many types of hemoglobinopathy. So sickle cell disease, you don't normally require genetic testing. The only time when it is useful is to confirm the genotype. So there are other related conditions. So HBS beta thalassemia, so that's when a patient inherits one sickle mutation and one beta thalassemia mutation, and that causes a type of sickle cell disease. So knowing the beta thalassemia mutation is very useful for those patients because, again, it contributes to the severity of the disorder. So genetic testing is more useful for thalassemias and hemoglobin variants that are not identifiable using the protein techniques that we discussed. And it's also the only method available for prenatal diagnosis. And this is because in a prenatal setting, you are not looking at, you can't assess the adult hemoglobin content of a developing fetus. So a sample is taken of fetal tissue, so that's either via a chorionic villus sample or an amniocentesis at the moment. Now, there is lots of work ongoing at the moment to develop a non-invasive prenatal diagnosis test for sickle cell disease and thalassemia. And this is where the diagnosis is made using free fetal DNA that's extracted from the maternal blood. Now, this has been implemented for several other genetic conditions, but there are some unique complexities about hemoglobinopathies that make it slightly more challenging technically to carry out. So it's just taking a bit longer to get that set up. Genetic testing can also be useful for patients who have had a red blood cell transfusion. So if you take a peripheral blood sample from a patient who's had a blood transfusion, as is the treatment for a lot of these conditions, the protein, the hemoglobin proteins that you then extract from that blood will not be representative of their true genotype. So most red blood cell transfusions are leukocyte depleted, so they don't contain significant levels of white blood cells, because when we do genetic testing, it's the DNA that we use, genomic DNA, is extracted from the white blood cells only, because red blood cells don't have a nucleus, so they don't have genomic DNA within them. You can make a genetic diagnosis from a peripheral blood sample where you can't use the protein techniques. It's the only method available for accurate diagnosis of alpha thalassemia, again, because of the huge amount of crossover between the different genotypes and the laboratory findings. And it's the only method for accurate diagnosis of beta thalassemia subtype. So that's really the level of reduction that you would expect in the beta globin gene. Now, this slide is not really necessarily for you to kind of notice all the details and read in any great detail, but this just is our genetic testing algorithm that we use within our laboratory. So it's really just to demonstrate the kind of complexity of the different genetic testing techniques that we need to use in order to be able to diagnose the different conditions. And this is purely because of that kind of highly complex genetic landscape of the conditions, and the high level of sequence similarity between the genes. So on the left, you can see the pathway that we would take for a query hemoglobin variant, so a sickle or a HBC. And on the right, you can see the path that we would take for a thalassemia, possible thalassemia case. And the technique that we use within the genetic testing lab is dependent on what type of mutation we're expecting. So we use the phenotypic data from the patient, so the full blood count and the HPLC results, to inform which type of test we're going to do first. So we use Sanger sequencing to detect point mutations, and this will pick up most beta thalassemia mutations. We use gap PCR to pick up common deletions, and this will pick up most of the alpha thalassemias. We then use MLPA, which is a method to detect copy number variants, so it assesses copy number across the alpha and beta cluster. So this will pick up rare deletions, and also an allelic condition called hereditary persistence of fetal hemoglobin, HPFH. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into that now, but if you're interested in any further reading, I'd be happy to provide you with that about HPFH, because it's, again, another complex and very interesting aspect of hemoglobinopathies. We also use some targeted assays, so TACMAN, qPCR, quantitative real-time PCR, where we are just looking for a single mutation. So that's used mostly for sickle cell disease. So this is an example of a Sanger sequencing plot, just to run through very briefly how Sanger sequencing works. So we use PCR to amplify the gene region that we're interested in. So in this case, it would be the beta globin gene. We use a bead-based cleanup of the PCR products. We then use a fluorescent dideoxy sequencing reaction, so a classic Sanger sequencing reaction. The sequencing products are then cleaned up using another bead-based cleanup process, and then the cleaned up sequencing products are run out on a capillary electrophoresis machine where we get this single base pair resolution. And on the right here, you can see an example of the sickle mutation shown on a Sanger sequencing trace. So on the top trace, you can see the sequence of the normal beta globin gene, and on the bottom, you can see the A is substituted for a T on one of the alleles. So this is a heterozygous carrier of the sickle mutation. Now here we have an example of gap PCR. So this is quite a traditional method that we use, but it's very effective method for picking up the most common alpha thalassemia deletions. So by far the most common alpha thalassemia deletion is this 3.7 kb het. So it's the first one in this gel picture here. And this is where you have one alpha globin gene deleted. And then you can see the homozygote in the next lane, and then these are the various different common alpha deletions. So you run that as a PCR assay that amplifies across a known breakpoint for these common mutations. And we are able to multiplex that reaction so you can pick up all of the most common alpha thalassemia mutations in one assay. So it's very quick, very easy, very cheap, and very effective for picking up the vast majority of alpha thalassemias. Now, MLPA is slightly more labour intensive and much more expensive to do. So we don't do MLPA on every patient. We'll use the gap PCR to exclude the most common causes, and then only if we haven't found a cause for the query alpha thalassemia, we'll then go on to do MLPA. So this is multiplex ligation dependent probe amplification, where you have DNA probes designed complementary to your sequence of interest. So in this example, this is a beta globin MLPA trace. So you'd have probes complementary to each of the exons and intronic regions of the beta globin gene. The DNA probes are then hybridized to your patient DNA, and when the probes ligate together, they will only ligate together if they're bound to a complementary sequence. So the ligated probes are then amplified by PCR, and again, products run out on a capillary electrophoresis machine. And then the software that we use will calculate a dosage quotient. So you can see in this trace along the x-axis, you have all the different genomic locations that are targeted in the assay. And on the y-axis, you have the ratio. So a ratio of 1 means you have 2 copies of the gene, and a ratio of 0.5 means you have 1 copy of the gene. So that's a heterozygous deletion. So you can see here, the names of the probes are along the top here, so you can see that this deletion encompasses all of the HBB gene and partially of the delta gene, the HBD gene. So this would be a beta thalassemia mutation. And that brings me to the end of my talk for today. So just to give you a quick overview of what we've gone through. So I hope that I've managed to give you an overview of the whole topic in a very short time for a very complex group of genetic disorders. They're a common group of genetic disorders in certain worldwide populations, so early diagnosis is important to reduce the morbidity and mortality. And we use a combination of different laboratory tests to screen for the condition and diagnose the condition. And understanding the results of these fairly common lab tests are important for diagnosis and management of these conditions. So that's all for today, and just to say thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I've also got some further reading because I've had to go through quite a lot in quite a short time. So if you are interested in some further reading, I've just put some references here to some very, very useful review papers in case anyone wants to do any further reading. So with that, I'll say thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.